To boa tarde a todos. Good evening, and I know that some of you are just joining us now. Good evening to all of you who are joining us on the Facebook Live and other social media outlets. Welcome to each and every one of you. We are happy to have you on board for another one of our lectures from the PBBI FLAD the spring semester of 2021 speaker series at Fresno State. And we have just about one lecture per week. We've went from 4 lectures per semester, which was already quite challenging when we were in person. And now that we are in virtual, we are trying to do a total of about 12 this semester for the spring of 2021. Thanks to all who have joined us here on the webinar, and thanks to all of you who are joining us on Facebook Live. You can pose your questions throughout the evening, if those of you joining us on webinar, and I will try to look at those joining us also on the Facebook Live. It's a little bit harder sometimes because we are on several different pages, but we'll do the best we can. We, again, are honored to have our invited guests, our lecturer for this edition of PBBI FLAD lecture series. And it is Professor André Corrêa de Sá, who is an assistant professor in the Spanish and Portuguese department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. For those of you who are my generation or a bit younger or a bit older, Santa Barbara is kind of a cathedral to us in the Portuguese studies. We all have fond memories of Santa Barbara in one way or another. And Dr. André Corrêa de Sá has wide-ranging interdisciplinary interests in literatures and cultures of the Portuguese-speaking world, and work within a post-colonial and transnational framework, Portugal, Brazil, and the Lusophone Africa, focusing primarily on authors from the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. He has written on topics such as psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, romanticism and modernism, colonialism, post-colonialism, and more recently, environmental humanities, which fascinates me because it really is a trendsetter, I believe. And he is the author of, amongst others, the Depressão e Psicoterapia em António Lobo Antunes, Qualquer Coisa que Me Ajude a Existir, published by Leia Texto in 2019, and co-author of Mike Tyson para Principiantes, Antologia Poética de Rui Costa, published by Sírio and Alvin in 2017. Prior to joining the University of California, Santa Barbara, he taught at the Federal University of São Carlos in São Paulo, Brazil. He teaches undergraduate courses in Portuguese and Lusophone African studies, and graduate courses on the relations between literature and the environment. He also contributes to the Center of Portuguese Studies at UCSB, which seeks to foster the study of the literatures, languages, and language, I should say, and cultures of the Portuguese-speaking world in the U.S. Professor André Corrêa de Sá did his undergrad at the University of Coimbra and his PhD at the University of Évora in Portugal. We are happy to have him. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. The title of his presentation is In the Land Where Lemon Trees Bloom. I love the title. I've said it that a million times. Eduardo Mayone Dias and the Lusa Land, which we'll talk a little bit about. And I thank him, and especially because to many of us, and I know quite a few of us joining it on this webinar, and hopefully those joining on social media as well, the name Eduardo Mayone Dias touches us profoundly. He still is, because he's still living, although quite frail in health. And I'm going to get emotional, but I'm sorry, but he's a very dear friend whom taught immensely to me and many of my generation. I don't know what we would all be without Eduardo Mayone Dias. Just a quick anecdote: when I got hired to teach Portuguese, I asked him, do you think you can write a letter of recommendation to my school? And he wrote this letter of recommendation, which I have, because it was just phenomenal. I mean, I said to myself, I didn't do any of these things that he's saying, I don't think, but it is great to have. And so he's just a dear friend, participated in, we had 12 symposiums, Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage here in Tulare. He participated in 10 of the 12 and contributed immensely. And he was really dedicated to the community and to all of us in the Portuguese-speaking world and the Portuguese communities in California. So, André, thank you so much for being here and for taking on this challenge.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm deeply honored to be invited to this series of lectures. And I want to start by congratulating Denise Borges for all the wonderful work he's doing at Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute. And I know that we all must take pride in your ability to bring people together, your ability to create these kind of initiatives. And of course, I also want to thank all the support provided by FLAD to this initiative. First question, as always, is can you hear me? I suppose so. So I think it's all right.
Sounds a bit far. Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
we've had a little bit of a comment that said it sounded a little bit far. So maybe when we were conversing right before, you sounded superb, but now it does sound a little bit far. And we had two of the participants ever told us that.
Is it better?
Much better. Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Okay. So as you told, I'm introducing a man who really needs no introduction in California. Eduardo Mayone Dias embodies a unique blend of intellectual traits, and chances are quite high that every time you conduct a research about the history of Portuguese communities in California, you will stumble a number of times on this name. And let me start by sharing with you something Onésimo Almeida once wrote about Mayone Dias. Let me just, Ines, can you enable screen sharing?
I sure can, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for the mix-up there. So Eduardo, you should be on now.
It's working, perfect. Let me just. Okay, it's not working. So that's what Onésimo wrote. Eduardo Mayone Dias is a scholar and a gentleman. He has a unique place as a pioneer in the research on the history of the presence of the Portuguese in California. A native of Lisbon, is often referred to as Azorean, even by readers familiar with his work, on account of the empathy it displays for the people whose culture he so well captures in his writings. The elegance of his prose is only matched by the elegance of his speech in the classroom, in his lectures, or in a simple chat among friends. Well, I think this is a very good description. And in many ways, my presentation is just a follow-up to this description. My remarks draw a brief sketch of the life and works of Eduardo Mayone Dias. Mayone Dias contributed a lot to the cause of Portuguese studies in the United States, particularly on the theme of immigration and diasporic cultures. In particular, I'd like to talk about the ways in which Eduardo Mayone Dias deployed a concept of country, or better, a certain use of this concept that is worth still fighting for. A concept of country that embodies and creates awareness of the historical events, cultural movements, and institutional structures articulating the experience of Portuguese immigrants and their offspring in California. It is timely to underline that there is literally an ocean between Portugal and America. And one of the consequences of having this ocean is that America is generally seen by the Portuguese as a sort of fixed point. And, you know, I mean, American cultural ideas are now kind of common currency in Europe. But there was a time when being progressive and leftist would be anything but American. Back then in Portugal, being progressive and leftist was basically tantamount to accepting French Marxist ideas. And in the USA, there was nothing, that's what we were told. In the USA, there was nothing to take advantage of. Americans even believed in God and were anti-communist, which for someone keen on reading Sartre or Althusser were non-recommended guidance. So the United States stood for evil in all its aspects: consumerism, and alienation of labor, economic and military imperialism. Of course, many things have changed in the past 30 years or so. French is no longer the language of the left-wing progressive intellectuals, and the Portuguese academia now draws its vocabulary, hype, stereotypes, and epistemological frameworks from its American counterparts. While these trends were shifting from one side to the other, Eduardo Mayone Dias has been here or there all time, explaining that the real American is quite different from the American created by the imagination of the European left-wing intellectual. All we literature professors struggle with the fact that many of the things we do under the banner of criticism are not socially relevant. But Mayone Dias somehow managed to break the crust of the academic conversation toward the big world, where things actually happen. He has a knack for speaking to immigrants in their own language. He speaks about what he touches and what he sees. And that's something that, as an immigrant myself, I really can relate with. Immune to changing theoretical trends and cultural wars, Mayone Dias chronicled the immigration across different spatial scales and veered the conversation toward the workings of everyday life. He played a significant role in rendering Portuguese communities visible. Among many other things, we can credit him for much of what we know, for instance, about the dairy industry, the Portuguese language press, the tuna industry in San Diego, the Portuguese Fraternal Society movement, and also about Portuguese American literature. So his greatest accomplishment, I would say, is having become one of the key cultural mediators between Portugal and America since the 1960s. His works are a constant source of insightful accounts, descriptions, and contrasts that give us new ways of looking to our surroundings. Since his arrival to this country in 1960s, he has done a lot for us. For 30 years, Eduardo Mayone Dias taught Portuguese language, literature, and culture at UCLA. From the community of Artesia in Los Angeles, where he settled, Mayone engaged with stories about the life and livelihood of immigrants, mainly from the Azores, of course. I think it's fair to say that he made himself into an Azorean, and he studied and passed down Azorean roots, memories, and traditions. As a professor, scholar, a cultural historian, and a public intellectual, Mayone Dias mentored an important generation of Lusophone scholars. He also served in numerous capacities the Portuguese American communities in California. And even more importantly, he formulated certain critical issues of the immigration experience, issues of the past and of the present. Following Onésimo Almeida, I will argue that Mayone Dias' works are particularly prone to arouse emotions and create bridges between peoples and places. Mayone clearly understood that academia would operate more powerfully if it engaged with things outside academic departments. His work combines a missionary zeal about Portuguese culture with a concern, a very deep concern about the livability of immigrant communities in California. And because of that, he played a unique role in promoting collaborative networks between academic institutions, communitarian organizations, and individuals. That means that Mayone Dias has also been rather important to the task of improving the self-definition of Portuguese American communities by presenting these communities from within, from the outside, and to its members. Rather than just emulating certain imageries of social life, Mayone's work amounts to a form of knowledge that it is more about clustering readers around a sense of community than relying in patronizing forms of objective ethnography. Eduardo Alberto Mayone Dias was born in Lisbon, Portugal, on February the 2nd, 1927. His father was from Lisbon. His mother was Spanish from Seville. He studied English and German at the University of Lisbon, segueing into a teaching career in Portuguese high schools for about 10 years. At some point of this period, he participated in an exchange program in the United States and met Margarita, with whom he soon married in Mexico before going back to Portugal the same year. 2 years later, he went to Cambridge, where he spent an academic year teaching Portuguese language. But Margarita did not adapt to the inclemency of the English weather, and they decided to move to Mexico with promise of a job at UNAM. To our luck, that job never came. And in February 1962, Mayone Dias took a job at the Army Language School in Monterey, California. And but he left this post a year and a half later, moving to UCLA to pursue a PhD in Portuguese, or Spanish and Portuguese. Soon after entering graduate school, he landed a teaching position in the Spanish and Portuguese department at UCLA and stayed there for almost 3 decades. He ended up by completing his PhD in Spanish, not at UCLA, but at University of Southern California, with a thesis on the relationship between Menéndez Pelayo, the great Spanish critic, and Portuguese literature, getting, and this is his expression, the best of both worlds. Well, I heard about Eduardo Mayone Dias for the first time shortly after arriving in Santa Barbara in 2017. At the house of a department colleague and a very dear friend, Eduardo Paiva Raposo, one of the most renowned Portuguese linguists. And around the coffee table after lunch, we were talking about Portuguese writers or professors or any kind of who had lived or written about Santa Barbara. And at some point he asks me something like, "Do you know Mayone?" No, I said, does not ring a bell. And he replied, Mayone wrote very interesting, witty chronicles about life in the United States, and some of them even mentioned Santa Barbara and UCSP. Well, to speak frankly, I thought that he was a former student. And you know, the conversation ended here. I had no idea about who Mayone was. This was on a Sunday, and the next day, Monday, after teaching my classes, I decided to go to the library and look for books from this author, Eduardo Mayone. That's what I had memorized from this author mentioned by Eduardo Raposo that I had never heard of until the previous day. And so I did. And I quickly came into two collections of chronicles and another book that I see as a collection of studies, essays, interventions titled Coisas da Lusalândia. And by the early 70s, Mayone started writing in Diário Popular, a very famous Lisbon newspaper. And over the following years, he regularly contributed with various prominent newspapers from Portugal, from California, from Massachusetts, from Canada, and such as Jornal Português, Portuguese Tribune, Portuguese Times, Diário de Notícias, A Capital, Correio da Manhã, Sol Português. So he wrote extensively for a number of newspapers, and he mainly wrote chronicles, of course, as a literary genre. Chronicle, there's no good equivalent in English. Chronicle is something, it's basically an umbrella term under which we stuff different things. And Mayone's gentle-mannered chronicles can be described as an autoethnographic vehicle through which personal views about immigration are expressed. In these chronicles, American life can be both subject to entertaining descriptions and very erudite, penetrating discussions. The bulk of his chronicles examine some of the features of the Portuguese American experience in California, offering a detailed and magnified profile on particular traces of the hyphenated experience. Drawing from autobiographical experiences, these brief stories comprise a wide-ranging reflection of everyday life in the United States. They are a consequence of the encounter and contamination with difference and the unexpected. Well, an identity, as we know, is the underlying text of the narrative through which we tell others what we are and how we became what we are. In this sense, his chronicles are living data about lived experience of the immigrant generation. His brief essays, stories, and commentaries carry examination down to specific features or traces of the American life. His subject matters range from the idiosyncrasies of the Homo Americanos to technical descriptions of a common day in an American university campus, and poetic observations about his neighbors in Los Angeles. Part is on the order of sightseeing, part is sort of a literary gag spiced up with a friendlicious irony. Part is what we typically call social observation. Some of them are strictly driven by the purpose of contrasting Portuguese life with American life at a time when Portugal was still under Salazar's dictatorship, and some double has historical investigations around major topics of diasporic studies. Read today, some of these chronicles might strike us quite obvious, but one must not forget that they refer to a specific historical setting, and years pass as years do. So historical circumstances have changed a lot, and the contrasts between Portugal or the Azores and the United States are much less manifest today than they were 50 years ago. In the preface to Novas Crónicas das Américas, New Chronicles of the Americas, Mayone himself acknowledges that this assemblage of stories primarily operates in an archaeological mode. To a certain degree, some of these pieces, while vibrant and colorful, seem to be, well, limited to surface perceptions or to commonplace views of the American lifestyle. His neighbors' idiosyncrasies or a Sunday visit to Disney World sort of lost the character of novelty they had at the time. But on the other hand, these stories bring up a certain pattern of experience, revealing the historical environment underlying those moments and representing the past, presenting again the past, is accounts, for instance, about bilingual education programs in California or the Portuguese summer courses in Santa Barbara have the ability to make us feel the past as an immediate experience, surfacing moments of the past within the broad new dimension of the present. And this impact, the way this kind of representation of the past can manifest itself is, in my opinion, overwhelming effect of his chronicles. Anyway, and getting a little bit back to that Monday when I started reading Mayone Dias for the first time, that Monday after dinner, I started not by the Chronicles, but by the other book I was mentioning, Coisas da Lusalândia. You can see the picture, the cover picture in the center image. And I started by Coisas da Lusalândia. It's a thicker book, you know, and it's this book that I want to explore a bit more in the following. Coisas da Lusalândia features several moments and topics of the history of the presence of the Portuguese presence in California. And some critics label this book as a collection of chronicles as well. I think it has a more scholarly drive, and many of these pieces are thoroughly documented and are kind of historical studies that stretch across various aspects of the history and social life of Portuguese American communities, showing how its ecologies in a broad sense were shaped. And in the elegant prose that it is one of Mayone's trademarks, the first paragraph of this volume's prologue underpins the central attitude of his work, of Mayone's work, in terms of a conversation with cultures. Let me just show you a piece of this, what I am referring to, this excerpt. When Onésimo Almeida proposed the term Lusalândia, Lusaland, he explained that we, the Portuguese in the United States, are not a country. Sorry, Onésimo, but we are. Of course, we were never recognized by the United Nations, nor do we have political autonomy, but we are culturally independent, to be sure. We are no longer 100% Portuguese, yet we are light years away from being 100% Americans. We constitute the Azorian 10th island with a few more minorities as any other self-respecting nation. We have our own language, Lusalandês, with which we get along very well with each other. Thank you very much. Sorry, Onésimo, but we are a country. And this may not be the most remarkable phrase of the book, and it's also a bit unfair to Onésimo's work about immigration, but the way Mayone uses the expression country produces an ecology of memory about which I would like to say something more. Of course, the term Lusaland was proposed by Onésimo Almeida in the early 70s. Onésimo was deeply impressed by the self-segregation of Portuguese American community in the early 1970s and coined the term Lusalandia to describe the situation of the Portuguese communities at that time. So Lusalandia, as everyone knows, was a Portuguese enclave in America, a Portuguese island, geographically dispersed in small islands, mainly in New England and California, surrounded by America on all sides. Well, with this kind of low-key rebuke, Mayone Dias is extending the term beyond the closed form he seems to identify in Onésimo's formulation. His concept of country is somewhat obscure, of course, and in many senses, the way he grants rights to this country and their citizens does not appear to be very different from the way Onésimo himself also grants rights to this country and its citizens. Anyway, by insisting in embracing the Portuguese American communities in the form of a country, Mayone Dias was pointing out three things. A, there is a gap separating the network of things we call Portugal and the network of things we call Lusaland. B, this gap means that the experience of the immigrant bases its meaning against the context of a world of unique contingencies. C, rather than a logical grouping of ready-made statements about identity, this world of unique contingencies should be traced through a pattern of experience that it is at odds with any other pattern of experience. So, in a practical sense, this concept of country appears to be the concept through which Lusaland has standing and claims its rights against both the Portuguese or Azorian pattern of experience and the American pattern of experience. And there's nothing parochial in it. So in historical terms, this country is a combination of a point of no return with a strong sense of caring. In symbolic terms, this country speaks to the fact that an immigrant can't go home again, and to the necessity of getting in tune with a new way of living. In political terms, this country is a tool, an instrument that Portuguese Americans can use to make Portuguese count. So implicit in this concept of country is the idea that a country, and I do agree with Mayone, of course, a country is something that must be itself and not some other thing. So it is not a matter of longing for a world long lost, but a matter of coexisting within a unique world of life. In that sense, the concept of country deployed by Mayone entails a specific form of liability. Liability, of course, towards our communities in a wide sense. Building a new life in America involves stepping out of the Portuguese habitus and start a different living arrangement in a different part of the world, partaking with the other joint tenants of that world, be they life forms, landscapes, cultures, temporalities. This country is distinguished not only by its ethnic composition and institutions, but also by the many descriptions it provides of the American experience. Mayone Dias helped us coming to grasp this network of entanglements, he offers frames, vocabularies, reference points, and above all, he deploys a sense of participatory self-image. At the same time, Mayone's concept of country, it's not a question of self-containment in a nativist ethnic frame, quite the contrary. Mayone uses this concept to show how communities found their way in history through a series of encounters with otherness. From his perspective, cutting off Portuguese values, beliefs, and rituals would amount to cutting off the fully incorporation of the Portuguese immigrants into the American story, which is another way of saying that rather than urging to a preservation of an idealized identity, he was urging community leaders to promote not only a community of culture, but also a community of interests that could unfold toward an institutional community. This concept of country insists in bringing to the table the struggle for distinction, showing ways in which a proper adaptation to the social political life of both countries, or America and the Azores, or Portugal, benefits both the newcomers and the receiving society. So Mayone Dias, by documenting the Portuguese-American experience, was mainly concerned with opening pathways to integration. And this is the light in which we should see his rebuke, his low-key rebuke to Onesimus' formulation. His point was that the concept of country as something with a core narrative and a proper shape is required if one wishes to consider the specific issues, places, and roles immigrants occupy in the social structure and in the system of production. Issues such as English acquisition, education, health and well-being, economic mobility, equal treatment, social cultural interaction, and civic participation and citizenship. There is no apology for a form of monological nationalism in this concept of country, not even a literary cultural nationalism. The key words are adaptation and solidarity. Turning his attention to various topics of its history, Mayone deploys a powerful common narrative that creates routes of access to the Portuguese-American experience, a narrative that we can relate with. Documenting and mobilizing this collective history, Mayone steers us through an internal map of its past and challenges, traditions, social and cultural environment brought by it. His historical knowledge also fulfills the goal of steering people up. As I said, Mayone is speaking to a particular sensibility, a particular entanglement of life rhythms, a particular ecology, a particular dialect, in some, a particular kind of social being close to what Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus. By examining the connection between the preservation of self-identity and dynamics of subject-form stories, Mayone showed how memory and hope are part of the same life world. And that's why he advocated in the strongest terms about the importance of fully participating in socio-political projects and networks and making Portuguese American identity distinctive, attractive, and valuable. The case of California offered Mayone and offers us a stock example of how the Azorean landscape went through expansions and transformations when exposed to American conditions. This transformation is a matter of extension and movement. Immigrants are usually caught in histories of disturbance, and their social identities, particularly in the case of their offspring, encompass multiple and shifting positions in terms of gender, social class, race, ethnicity, age, religion, and sexuality. The islander, predominantly agrarian, found in California the landscapes where he could live as in his home island, except that the immensity of the endless stretches of fertile land in the Central Valley, spanning 450 miles from Sacramento to Bakersfield, exceeded his imagination and made him dream of a comfort and prosperity that in the islands only a handful of wealthy people could ever possibly know. Instead of 2 or 3 lean cows, the islander could aspire to own a herd with thousands of heads. He was just expected to do what most Americans do: work hard and give back to your community, improving the lives of your fellow citizens. Imbued with this work and communitarian ethic, Azorians settled in the new landscape, strengthening a sense of permanence that contrasted with the typical pattern of Portuguese immigrants in France, Germany, or even the East Coast. Opposed to what happened in the mainly urban communities of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, in California, social life has been maintained as narrow, sometimes as narrow as in the village of origin. Some commentators comparing the differences between the East Coast and West Coast communities suggest that the rural tradition, the isolated family circle, typical of American communities, may have delayed or hindered the process of acculturation and assimilation in California. There may be some truth to this observation, and it is well known that we don't have a ferry street in San Jose where life in the islands could be recreated in Portuguese. In any case, however, immigrants, and especially their offspring already born in America, would quickly engage with American myth and forget or disregard the proverbial Lusitanian resignation. And I think this is an extremely important step of the acculturation. To become an American is to embrace a new myth, a new set of cultural practices, and in many ways, a sense of hope and optimism that it is not dominant, so to speak, in Portuguese culture. And in this sense, the country Mayone Dias is speaking about is the real hero of his stories. The country of which Mayone Dias speaks is precisely a metonymy of the ecological relations that flourish within a cultural system subject to the disturbance of immigration. Mayone Dias thought it was worth drawing attention to the rush of stories of how Azorian immigrants managed to transplant their landscapes to California, and overlapping these landscapes with the network of rhythms with which they coexisted were bound to shape a common landscape. Mayone's books speak to the expansion of this Portuguese-American country through the encounter with other forms of life. And what it interests me the most is the way he shows how the narrative of belonging is shaped by a transformative encounter. This is to say that the hyphenated identity, being Portuguese American, translates to a spatial experience endowed with particular complexities. Being proud in that country, in the lifestyle, beliefs, and traditions of its inhabitants is a necessary condition for a community that, if it was not already Portuguese, was also destined to become just American. It is precisely in co-mobility with ontological scheme and with the rhythms of the hyphen that Eduardo Mayone Dias developed his wide-ranging intellectual activity as a public intellectual. And I'm just finishing up. I'll just try to tie all the threads with a final comment. Mayone Dias, and I'm talking of his entire list of publications, which is very long, most composed by chronicles, but also different collections of scholarly works, textbooks. So he was a very prolific author. He deals with all kinds of different genres and forms of knowledge. And I think that he should be reminded, we should reread his books again, because he is able to deploy a cultural agenda from an auto-ethnographic sensibility. So offering an account of the historical and social foundations of this society, Mayone was able to show us how an immigrant from a Portuguese community in America is transformed into an American community of Portuguese descent. So Mayone Dias' books help us to grasp the history of generation that preceded us, blurring the distinctions between emotion, experience, representation, and performance. Mayone tried to understand the spatial processes of immigration in terms of networks, flows, and assemblies. And let me end this talk by explaining the title I chose. It's a very straightforward title, I would say. The land where the lemon trees bloom could be a quotation from Mayone Dias. It is not. It is, of course, an allusion to Goethe's famous verses, but it is also a very clear reference to our very own California. As we know, much of coastal and inland California is ideal for growing lemon trees. Citrus industry, in fact, has been extremely important to fuel economic and social development of California since the 19th century. And as you likely know, one of the most commonly grown variety of lemon trees in California is the Lisbon lemon. The kind of lemon in Portugal we call galego, so from Galicia. But Lisbon lemon, this variety of lemon tree tolerates heat, cold, and windy conditions. It produces several crops each year with strongly aromatic, flavorful leaves and fruit. The Lisbon lemon tree is easy to care, cold hardly, and can reach 30 feet tall with a canopy spreading 25 feet wide. It bears small to medium-sized, slightly oblong yellow fruits with similar acidic content and thick pulp. The main harvest of Lisbon lemons is in the spring and winter, but the tree, this is important, the tree produces fruits the whole year. I think this is a great metaphor to relate to the life and works of Eduardo Mayone Dias. Eduardo Mayone Dias is a native from Lisbon that found in California, especially within the Azorean communities, the ideal conditions to blossom and produce strongly aromatic and flavorful fruits. And these fruits are of the highest kind. Perhaps more than any other, Mayone Dias assisted the Portuguese American communities in California in coming to terms with the ethnopoetic processes through which a group of people clusters around the bulk of common beliefs, discursive practices, and rituals that, for want of a better word, we are used to call identity. His advocacy for political action and cultural preservation is still a very powerful equipment for the discussion of immigration issues. Mayone Dias identified events and figures in whom Portuguese immigrants or Portuguese Americans can take pride. In many ways, reading his books makes me feel more connected to this part of the world where historical contingencies have determined I should live. I deeply take pride in reading and rereading Mayone Dias books. And I end here, and with that, I'm happy to continue the conversation with Denise. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, André. Thank you so much. Fascinating. I enjoyed it tremendously, and I thought I knew Eduardo Mayone Dias. Now I know a different Eduardo Mayone Dias as well. It's a very fascinating take. Love the idea that you pulled together. Very well done. That's what an intellectual does, and congratulations on this wonderful piece of work. I know that Mayone Dias would like it immensely. I can tell you that. And we have a couple of questions. I have some comments and questions myself, but I'm going to give them my space to the audience. And one of the questions is from poet Millicent Borges Accardi, a very good poet who I enjoy reading. And Millicent asks, do you think there are distinct differences noted between Portuguese communities, for example, Artesia, San Diego, Santa Barbara, San Francisco, and San Diego?
In a very short answer, I would say yes, because each community in one way or another clusters around a different sense of community. And I think that's something that Mayone Dias in some sense was talking about. So having said that, we have different layers of communities. That's what I think. So, and we engage in these different communities in different ways as well. So I would say that each community is different in the same sense that our children are different from one another, but at the same time, we can also rely to a kind of a common banner or a more holistic sense of community in terms, of course, of a shared common identity. So yes, indeed. And no.
Yeah. Well, indeed, and I think as you touched upon on your talk and Mayone Dias's writings, which is there is this commonality that bridges all of us together. But then we embrace the different landscapes, as you said, and so the landscapes are different between San Diego and the San Joaquin Valley and Bay Area, and it's produced some different. For example, as one of the things that Mayone also wrote about, which he wrote extensively about the tuna industry in San Diego. He had a fondness for the fishing industry. And San Diego became, in many ways, a very matriarchal society in difference to other Portuguese communities that were not, because of the fishing industry, because of the landscape that the folks in that area had to live with, had to embrace. So indeed, that's a
different ecology. So
correct. While I was growing up, and this is from writer Anthony Barcelos, who is the author of a great book that we're going to be launching. It's now virtually, because it's available now as a e-reader. The novel of the Portuguese American experience, very Azorian American experience, I should say, in the Central Valley, land of milk and money. And for a lot of us, Anthony, there was a lot more milk than money. While I was growing up in a Portuguese-speaking family in the Central Valley in the 50s, I recall that my immigrant grandparents referred to all English speakers as os americanos. And until I was a teenager, let me see here, until I was a teenager, my California-born siblings and I used the term without any self-consciousness, although we were English-speaking Americans. Was this part of the pattern that kept Luso-American enclaves separate from the larger culture and preserved our heritage? Very interesting take.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you as well for the previous question. You certainly know more about this than I do. don't really have that lived experience. But the idea that I always entertain is that an assimilation process is a process. So it goes throughout a series of transformations, a series of dealings with different aspects of reality. California, as a great part of the United States, is composed of multiple communities of immigrants, and each of these communities kind of creates its own country. So I totally understand that it's growing in between. That's the perfect image for that formulation, that idea. So anyone who grows in between is part of two worlds or three worlds at the same time, and sometimes has some issues with self-image, with self-identification, of course. And that's why I think it's so important to have someone, not just as Mayone Dias, but has Dinis Borges as well, and probably some of those in the audience. It's important to have these documents, these memoirs, these accounts, these ways of reflecting about living experiences, about entanglements, about different patterns of experience. So I think we should preserve, we should produce as much as we can of these documents, enlarge our archive of the immigration, so to speak, and try to figure out ways of using this information, this knowledge about the past, as a tool, not an example. I don't think that history has the kind of educational ability that used to have 100 years ago. But I think that experiencing again the past, representing the past, might be a very powerful narrative device, or a tool to engage in a very powerful narrative device. So I just have to thank for that very interesting question. And I think that's why Mayone Dias is still so relevant, so useful, so important for us today.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. So when you started to read it, and obviously you touched upon this, that from a Sunday conversation,
Yeah.
who is Mayone Dias? So you find in your reading of Mayone Dias that although dated to basically most of his writings, as you mentioned, as you rightly mentioned, the 70s and the 80s, and some in the 90s as well, but he hasn't been writing as extensively as he was obviously once was until about 20 years ago, and you find that his writings are still relevant, and from the basically the creativity, as you said, of talking about this country, of talking about of the bridging of these two cultures. So it is something that even though we might reread it, it's not 20 years later or 25 years later, it is still relevant to the community that one is creating every single day.
That's exactly my point. So I think that much more than being a useful document, it's a very powerful tool to rewrite our narratives, or to write in my case, to write my narrative as an immigrant. As Mayone Dias confesses that while he was living in Lisbon, he had no idea about the Azores. He did not know a thing about the Azores. But when he came to California, he understood that engaging with that kind of experience would be extremely important for his own experience. That's why at some point he says, when he's answering back to Onésimo, he says, we, the Azorians, we Azorians. So this is this core attitude, I think, that can be followed throughout his works, his writings, up to our present. So that's why I urge everyone to reread his books. Some are hard to find. They are not for sale, of course, but our libraries in America are pretty much have the entire collection. So I think it is extremely important to reread his writings and try to make this exercise of understanding the ways in which he represents that experience of the past. So it causes a tremendous impact. And sometimes it's not about a form of knowledge, a form of making sense with the past, but a form of experiencing. I read chronicles about Santa Barbara, about Goleta, UCSB, and of course it's part of my living experience. So I kind of find new perspectives. I kind of rewrote my own personal narrative in this country by reading his books.
Indeed.
Sorry for being so.
No. There's a comment it's a comment actually from Eduardo Eusebio, who is a leader in the Portuguese American community, many years chair of the Luso American Education Foundation, Luso American Financial, has been involved in many things. And Professor Eduardo Eusebio says, very interesting to the reference to the land where the lemon trees bloom. We could make many inferences regarding immigration and the immigrant life, considering the sweet flower, the bitter fruit, the thorns for protection. From all of us who know and worked, of course, with Mayone Dias, we thank you, and we do thank you. And indeed.
No, I thank you. The opportunity was a pleasure.
I have one other question that you mentioned. Yeah,
sure.
Sorry, I won't take too much. I know we're upon the hour and everybody wants to probably have dinner or something. But the idea of the public intellectual, and you referenced that, and as one thing that Mayone he was a public intellectual.
Yes.
I don't think he ever said no to any talk anywhere, whether it be at a Portuguese soccer club or a Portuguese hall or a Portuguese Holy Ghost Association or a university, college, a high school, an elementary school. We spoke with them too, and he never played it down. He was the same Mayone Dias, with the same thought process, with the same respect for everyone, whether he was talking to a group of intellectuals at University of California, Santa Barbara, where I attended many conferences that he gave. It was the same level of respect that he was talking at the Holy Ghost celebration to people who, were not, who some of them did not know. The older generation did not know how to read or write very well. That's not the case, of the ones he spoke to that were younger in the 1970s, obviously in 80s and even in the 60s. But he spoke with the same level of integrity and the same level of respect, independently of his audience. Do you think that's something that, first of all, is that something very Portuguese, or is it not very Portuguese from your perspective? I don't see too many public intellectuals in Portugal. We have them. We have, many of them. We have folks like, some of our writers. Miguel Torga was very, present in different things, and so was, of course, Vitorino Mezio and others that you know better than I do. First of all, that and how important is that even in today's world, even especially when we have all these gadgets and all these ways to communicate one another? How important is for the intellectual to be present, not being and always being who he or she is?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we don't have many public intellectuals nowadays, not even in America, unfortunately. And I see a public intellectual as someone capable of redescribing social experience in terms of an expansion of freedom. What I'm trying to say is that a public intellectual is someone able to branch out toward different parts of the experience, life worlds, different ways of being, and it's capable of doing so with lots of empathy. empathy would probably be the right word. And I think that Mayone Dias was able to be everywhere, all time, and engaging in very different conversations with very different people, you know, and that's something that we clearly understand from his books. Um, so I don't. I'm not answering your question. I think it's a very difficult question.
No. But you are in the wrong. You are, and I was just saying that from reading him, you felt that he was a public figure.
Yes, very clearly. And I will say much more than George Sena, for instance.
Yeah.
Although George Sena was very powerful. Yeah,
right.
But sometimes he lacked the ability to grow roots in some places. So there was a gap.
Indeed. In the growing roots aspect, Mayone is miles away from Sena, obviously, in California. Yeah. We're just about out of time, but we thank you to poet Décio de Oliveira, who actually in Portuguese, thanked you for your superb presentation, which it was, and then Mayone Dias would like it. I think he would. I know he would, and Professor Duarte Silva from Professor Emeritus. I keep on saying he's too young to be emeritus, from the Stanford University. Again, thanks to myself. He doesn't have to thank me. Thank André for affording us the opportunity to honor our beloved, indeed, Professor Eduardo Mayone Dias. He was and remains the best among us. I treasure the courses I took with him, and so admire his intellect and humble demeanor, indeed. So I think that's a perfect way to end it with Duarte's comment. Thank you again, Professor André Corrêa de Sá.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
wonderful. This is wonderful in many, many ways. I hope you are going to publish this, your paper, because Mayone Dias would be very, very honored. And I know that, and we need it because we are not, in my perspective, we're not writing enough. And we're so happy that you are at UC Santa Barbara, that you're doing, of course, your various studies in various fields, but that you have taken an interest in the Portuguese American community. It is important. The community is not the same community that it was with Mayone Dias, but it's a different community and one that needs to keep on being studied and looked upon and written by our intellectuals that are in the various departments throughout the state of California and beyond.
Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right, and it's something that it is part of my present future endeavors to
wonderful
understand, not just understand, but to intimately engage with Portuguese American literature in all kinds of ways, even regarding my eco-critical approach to literature. Yes,
indeed. Well, thank you again. Good night to all of you. Good night to André. Thank you very much, and everyone, keep on watching these, and we'll be talking to you about more events coming up. Thank you again. Good night to all. Thank you. Good night. Boa noite.